On behalf of the Duke Program in American Grant Strategy, let me welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Paul Miller. I want to make sure that you, because there's a lot of Stephen Miller in the news today, and it occurred to me that you all might have gotten conflated the two. I assure you they are very, very different.
Because all of you could possibly be interested in me.
This is what I was telling you. But I said, after I do that, there's going to be this awkward whoop, and everyone but no, you're making the wise choice of staying. So this program is co-sponsored by the AGS program, by the Triangle Institute for Security Studies, by the Political Science Department, and of course by Sanford, which is hosting our venue. We've got a number of things coming down the pike on February 10th. Next week we've got Chris Kirchhoff, who's coming. He's a partner with the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which is this new investment platform that DoD has created to leverage the newest technologies and sort of startup entrepreneurial stuff. And he's a partner in that, and he's going to be talking about that. And then on the 13th, week after that, we have Jane Hall Lute. Jane Lute was Deputy Undersecretary for Homeland Security, and she'll be talking about cyber security. She also has, she's right now she had been Assistant Secretary General of the UN for peacekeeping. She's back there doing a major project for the Secretary General on human trafficking, but I think she'll mainly talk about cybersecurity, although you can of course ask her about the others. If you're doing a summer internship, and you need funding, do send that application in to Allie by February 15th. A couple more things that are coming down the pike. Rosa Brooks, who's a lawyer at Georgetown, I think, and she's a law professor, but was in the Obama Defense Department. Very insightful commentator on the national security scene. She's coming. And Kori Schake is coming as well. She's also a very insightful commentator, so they're all coming that week. And then we have more people to come. Can I announce Jared? Is it safe to announce Jared Cohen?
Yes.
Okay, Jared Cohen, who headed Google Ideas and created it as Google Ideas, and now is head of something of Jigsaw, which is, they keep on changing the name. But he's very innovative thinker at the technology forefront. Lots and lots of interesting things. But of course, it's all trumped by trying to make sense of what's happening in Washington today. And I think Paul is an excellent person to help us do that. Paul has received his PhD from Georgetown. And he was a CIA analyst and then detailed over to the White House in both the Bush and the Obama administrations, responsible for Afghanistan policy as one of the directors in the Afghan office. And he's now at the UT, at our sister center at University of Texas, the Clemens Center. It's our rich sister center. They have a lot, Texas-size endowment, but we partner with them on a lot of projects. And so he's a good friend of our program here. But he's written a book called American Power and Liberal Order, and you can buy it out there, and we'll get signed copies if you want. But I'm going to first say welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
And give us the elevator pitch version. It could be a long elevator.
Yes.
Up the
Up the whole Trump Tower.
yes. Well, what is the argument of the book?
Yeah. So thank you, and first, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming, even though it's me and not my evil twin brother, Stephen Miller. Happy to talk to you about my book and about anything else you all want to talk about tonight. So the book I started writing 4 or 5 years ago when I wanted to kind of learn the lessons of history and apply them to developing a framework for thinking about American foreign policy, the lessons of recent history, Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to think, like, what did we get right and wrong, and how do we apply those lessons to the future? And the short answer is, what I ended up writing was a rebuttal of Donald Trump's foreign policy. I didn't know that's what I was writing for the last 4 or 5 years, but that's what came out. What came out is what I think is going to be sort of a pre-bubble, if you will, of what the new administration is going to be doing. Shortest answer is I think that liberal order is the outer perimeter of American security. Liberal order is the outer perimeter of American security. Okay, so what's the liberal order? It's a culture. It's a culture and a set of institutions and a set of norms about how the world works. And when I say liberal, I don't mean the American progressive left. I mean classical liberalism, 18th century liberalism. So liberal order is a culture of world order characterized by all those norms that we all can recite from 8th grade civics class. Civil liberties, free societies, free markets, capitalism, relatively porous borders. Doesn't mean we can't have borders, but relatively porous. Globalization, freedom of the seas, sanctity of contract, peaceful dispute adjudication, maybe some permission for kind of humanitarian intervention, but that's liberal order. And I think liberal order is a good thing. I think it's a real thing, right? It actually exists, and I think it's a good thing, and we should invest in it. We should upkeep it, right? So that's kind of the argument of the book. It's real, it's good, let's keep it. Liberal order is good and real, and we should keep it. And I think that's kind of the opposite of what the Trump administration thinks. They're a nationalist administration instead of an internationalist administration. I would characterize this as an internationalist take. Our security is bound up with the security of other like-minded countries around the world, Europe, East Asia, Japan, South Korea, the democratic alliances. And so helping those other countries is good for us. In a sense, I do believe in America first. I just disagree about how to get there, how to secure our interests. Maybe that's the next question. I think that liberal order is the most effective way of securing America's interests. That's a very broad overview. That's the elevator pitch.
So it sounds like a great book for before Donald Trump got elected. If Steve were here, I might make two counter arguments. First, the electorate spoke and rejected that approach.
The electorate very clearly voted in overwhelming numbers for the other candidate.
Okay, well, but I mean, under law and order is rule of law, right? And under the rule of law and under the rules, there's no question that he won. So,
Yeah.
but second, that he won in part for reasons that you can trace to the fraying of the liberal order. That is, that the promises of the liberal order was rising tide will lift all boats, that the U.S. is so rich it can afford to pay the costs of providing for the public goods for everybody else. And that worked well for Davos men, but that didn't work out well for ordinary man and woman in America who got left behind by this order. So what's in it for them? What's in it for the people who did not benefit from globalization? Why should they buy into an American liberal order that is sort of won on the backs of their blood, if you will?
So, the 2016 election is a weird election. But you won't convince me that it was a foreign policy election. So when the electorate spoke and elected Donald Trump, I'm not convinced that they were voting very consciously for one foreign policy vision over another. I think that the message of the voters was far less explicit and far less, I think it was more inchoate than that. So I don't think that election 2016 was a referendum on the liberal order or on this foreign policy versus that foreign policy. Now, Donald Trump has espoused a nationalist message, and I think that's received some measure of endorsement from a portion of the electorate, sure. Now, has the liberal order failed in its promises? Well, not as much as you might think. The Trump administration, in his inauguration, he painted a very bleak picture of the United States, but it's not one that I think is well grounded. The United States is actually doing pretty well. Our manufacturing is continuing to increase. It's not actually shrinking. The carnage he talked about is not really supported by the statistics. Crime is down. Violent crime is down. Out of wedlock births are down. All that kind of stuff is actually decreasing. It's not increasing. So the perception that things are getting worse is actually not quite true. To the extent that we've had failures in recent years, and there's been plenty, I'd suggest that it's because we have failed to adequately invest in liberal order. I mean, some of the biggest failures in recent years are, hey, look, we lost the war in Iraq, and we have not really covered ourselves in glory in Afghanistan. And the 9/11 attacks happened, and we've been getting cyber attacked pretty regularly and successfully by all of our rivals. China is winning the first cyber war in history against us. These aren't failures of the liberal order, they're failures to adequately upkeep and maintain the liberal order. So yeah, there's problems, but I think they're problems that actually should be solved by reinvesting in the norms and institutions that have upheld world order since World War II.
Okay, let me try again. Because the argument that I hear you making, I've heard before. I heard it in Bush's second inaugural. And I heard it in Clinton's '94 national security strategy, promoting democracy abroad, et cetera, et cetera. And that logic led Congress to unanimously, in sense of Congress, endorse regime change in Iraq, which 1998, which laid the intellectual framework for President Bush invading Iraq and seeking to replace Iraq with a regime more congenial with the liberal order. How'd that go for us? So why isn't Iraq a failure, an example of the hubris that comes from wanting to defend the liberal order?
So Iraq, right? So doesn't Iraq disprove?
And this would be a Trump argument, right?
Right.
Trump claims that he opposed it.
Yeah, well, it was also an Obama argument.
Exactly.
So the critique I make about Trump is actually rooted in a critique about Obama. I think there's going to be continuity in the trend line here. President Obama came into office speaking like a liberal internationalist, but the pattern of behavior of his administration, he was temperamentally the most restrained president, I think, in 70 years, and ended up implementing a grand strategy more of retrenchment almost. And he never quite said that, but that's what he did, and now Trump has come into office and he's actually saying it. He's actually saying, this is what we need to do, we need to do more of it. So I think historians will look back and probably see some continuity in the trend line between Obama and Trump. Now this goes back to
we have to
lessons.
follow up on that. That'll be interesting. So, but make the rest of the argument about Iraq, and then we'll come back to that.
So this goes back to the lessons of history. I started out by saying, I want to learn lessons of history. And you've all heard the George Santayana quote, right? Those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And Robert Jervis has the important riposte, that those who do learn the lessons of history are doomed to make the opposite mistake. Right? So it's just this endless oscillation. And that, I think, is actually what I'd say is characteristic of the Obama administration and now the Trump administration. Obama thought the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan were, we need to do less in the world. We totally screwed it up. We need to do less. It was wrong for us to try. It was heuristic. It was overweening. It was too much. And so we need to lead from behind. We need to exercise strategic patience. We need to not intervene in Syria. We need to get out of Iraq. We need to put a deadline on the American surge in Afghanistan. And when we go into Libya, we're going to overthrow a government and then leave. That's how he thought he was learning the lessons of history. And I think actually what he did was make the opposite mistake. Instead of engaging smartly, he just disengaged entirely. I think the times did not call for disengagement. They called for re-engagement with greater wisdom, perhaps. So now Trump has come in, and he's kind of continuing the Obama grand strategy, based on the same, I think, false reading of history that motivated the Obama administration. They take Iraq as one big, massive refutation of everything that this represents. That's over-interpreting the recent past. It's a recency bias. If you look at the larger sweep of history, over 130 years since the United States really emerged as a great power, we've had a very consistent grand strategy. Increase our power and put it in the service of a liberal order. We've been doing that since 1898 at least, if not earlier. And over the long stretch, it's been stunningly successful. This is the high tide of freedom in all of human history. There's never been a time in human history where more people have lived under loosely free governments than there are now. Did Iraq turn out poorly? Yes, it did. Does that invalidate or disprove the entire history before them in the last century? No, it does not. So I don't want to over-interpret Iraq as a one data point to invalidate a century of, I think, relative success in American foreign policy.
Okay, well, what about the critique from the left, which would say what you just described as a very Whiggish interpretation of the last 100 years? But if you were living in Latin America, it wouldn't feel like that American foreign policy had been promoting a liberal order. It would have been promoting an authoritarian order and going around the world, lots of places America's involvement has been not so good. This would be the argument for the left.
Sure. And sort of maybe a two-pronged response. One is that Latin America actually is enjoying a sort of freest moment now. And we can't take all the credit for that, obviously, but even Latin America has now kind of become full members of the liberal order. When I say that over the century the United States has kind of led the construction of liberal order, I am not saying that it's been perfectly consistent or that it should have been perfectly consistent. Because frankly, liberalism needs to be leavened with some realism as well. You can't be a utopian liberal crusader. That is the flaw of Woodrow Wilson. He's not my favorite president by any stretch. Wilsonianism needs to be leavened with a degree of realism. That's why the subtitle here is A Conservative Internationalist Grand Strategy. Liberal internationalists like Wilson and probably Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter and I think John Kerry, not Obama, but John Kerry, they would want to be consistent liberal crusaders. And there's a real problem with that. It's utopian, it's unrealistic, it can lead to disillusionment, it can lead to cynicism, and it can lead to overreach. I think that it's appropriate for us to invest in liberal order where it matters most to us, where it matters most to the United States. It's appropriate for us to selectively build liberal order in the places that are of strategic importance to the United States. Europe, East Asia, most prominent. So that means there's inevitably going to be some hypocrisy there. There's inevitably going to be some, we're going to do a little bit of this here, but not there. Because we can't do everything all the time everywhere. We can't.
But isn't the lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan precisely that once you pay rigorous lip service to this ideal, you'll be hoisted on your own petard, and you'll have to embrace the democratic seedlings in Afghanistan, right. The most inhospitable soil for it. Well, that's where the critique is going. Doesn't this lead you to think, oh, we can plant a democracy in Afghanistan, and of course it can't. So how do you answer that critique?
Yeah, I mean the real lesson of Iraq is don't hire Peter Fever. Had to include that in there. There is a challenge in public diplomacy. And that's, I think, really the challenge you're offering here. The United States is the champion for these ideas, along with our partners and allies in Europe and East Asia. We talk about this stuff, even Obama talked about it in his Cairo speech in May of 11. He talked about it. And once you start talking about it, it makes it sound as if these ideals are universal, therefore always applicable, and therefore we always have to do everything, center everything around them. And I maybe would recommend tempering the public diplomacy a little bit. It is fine to have a grandiose statement like Bush did in his second inaugural, right? It's a policy to end tyranny in this world. I think that's appropriate now and then to have a grand, the Truman Doctrine. We will support free peoples everywhere, whether they're under attack from internal subversion or external attack. I think what Bush said was essentially the Truman Doctrine, just updated for the 21st century. There's nothing new about it at all. But in our day-to-day public diplomacy, I think it'd be fine for diplomats to be a bit more pragmatic and honest and say, look, right now what's most important to us is Europe, and that means the war in Ukraine is super important, and we want to defend Ukraine against attack, and that is really important to the United States. Syria is a tragedy, but it's one that's maybe beyond our ability to do anything about. We want the war in Syria to be over. We want human suffering to end. It's probably beyond our ability to do anything about it right now. And I think it'd be okay if diplomats actually said that kind of thing more bluntly, more often. That might help eliminate some of the disillusionment that comes from over-promising on liberal order.
That won't get you out of Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan, it was quite clearly in our interest to go.
Yeah.
Right? Taliban had hosted, provided a safe haven to Al-Qaeda, the most realist, conservative, whatever, I don't care what stripe of ism you are, you would go and punish Al-Qaeda with the attack.
And then what do you do?
So then what do you do? And at that point is when you're stuck with your hoisted on your own baton.
Well, except it's what I'm happy to be hoisted on. See, I'm in a tiny, tiny minority of human beings on this planet, in that I still think that the war in Afghanistan is just. I think it is important, I think it is winnable, and I think that we should have and should continue to invest in Afghanistan, even, yes, invest in their democracy. Now, I realize that I'm in a tiny minority as I say that. Most people don't believe one of those things is true. They probably don't think it's that important. They probably think it's unwinnable. They probably think it's just something that's too expensive and too hard. And I promise you, everything you think you know about Afghanistan is probably filtered through a media that is just not very well informed about these things. So Afghanistan had its first free and fair elections when? In 2004? No. 1965. Under a constitution that they wrote, not us, not any Westerners. They wrote a democratic constitution, and they held free and fair elections in 1965 and 1969. And then they re-adopted that constitution in 2004. They changed king to president. That's about all they did. So there is actually a democratic tradition in Afghanistan. The Afghans to this day love it. If you ask them, there are public opinion polls. They love majoritarian rule, they love elections, they love accountable governance. They're a little queasy on religious freedom, but for the most part, they love almost all of the things that we think of in that package of democracy and liberalism. They love it. Remember, 8 million people voted in their first presidential election in 2004. I remember those people with the pink ink on their fingers. They risked their lives to vote. So there is nothing, there's far less uniquely Western in these ideas than we commonly think. We didn't invent bureaucracy, the Chinese did. We didn't invent the rule of law. Hammurabi's law code is the first one. He was a Mesopotamia. He was an Iraqi. Right? So there's not a whole lot that's uniquely Western about these norms of governance that we've fostered, helped, partnered with the Afghans to build there. And we've made a lot of mistakes in Afghanistan. I worked as the director for Afghanistan under Bush and Obama, so I think I can safely say it's mostly my fault. Made a lot of those mistakes myself. If I could have done it all over again, I'd say search from day one. President Bush went in there, Secretary Rumsfeld went in there advocating a light footprint. I think that was a mistake. You don't do a light footprint in the most failed state in the world. You just don't. We spent 5 years there not building an Afghan army. That was a mistake. That created a power vacuum, allowed the Taliban to come back. We tried to pretend we were friends with Pakistan when actually they were effectively partnering with our enemies, the Taliban. That was a mistake. So we never lost an opportunity to make a mistake in Afghanistan. Does that disprove the idea of having done it right in the first place? No, it doesn't. There are many, if you could rewind history and replay the tape and do everything right, Afghanistan would look much, much better today. There's nothing foreordained about the mistakes and about the failures in Afghanistan. It could have been much better.
If we had reversed those decisions, we would have an Afghan army that the Afghan economy can't afford, and we might have lost control of Pakistan's nuclear weapons.
I understand the first one. Why do you say
that? The second one was the reason we didn't get tough on Pakistan is because at the end of the day, we didn't want to crack the Pakistan army, which was maintaining control over their nuclear arsenal. And so, as badly as we wanted them to help us in Afghanistan, we wanted even more to prioritize the nuclear issue. In other words, there were reasonable arguments for why we made those mistakes, those policy choices.
Yeah, that's true. And the first issue is one we're still stuck with today. Yeah. The Afghan army costs $6 or $7 billion a year and will forever. That's an acceptable price to pay for denying terrorists safe haven in the epicenter of jihadist terrorism in the world, which is, by the way, South Asia, not the Middle East. So if it costs $6 to $7 billion to field an allied army who agrees with us about the dangers of jihadism, by the way, more Afghans have died from terrorism than we have, and the Afghans have lived under Taliban rule and hate them, and so they have a very strong will to fight these guys. If it costs $6 to $7 billion to keep them in the field fighting our enemies, worth it. Totally worth it. Totally affordable. $6 to $7 billion is 0.5% of the federal budget. I mean, it's nothing. It's 0.0001% of the American economy. It's a rounding error. So that's sustainable. Nuclear issue. Pakistan always sold us this argument that be careful, don't put too much pressure on us because the jihadists are at the gates and they're going to march on Islamabad, they're going to take over, they're going to have nukes. Do you really think that even the best armed jihadists could overthrow the Pakistani government, which, by the way, had like the second or third largest army in the world? Do you think a nation of 200 million people could be taken over that way? Islam in Pakistan is not radical, it is deeply, deeply traditional. And what we would call civil society is very vibrant in Pakistan. And it's very not radicalized. It is centered on local forms of worship towards shrines and saints that is just not amenable. Look, it's mostly Barelvi and Hanafi. It is not Hanbali. It is not Deobandi. So I never bought the argument that Pakistan was about to follow jihadists. We just couldn't do that. And the nuclear command and control has improved in the last decade. It's not what it used to be.
Okay, let me try again then. Let me pick a different line of attack.
Just say you agree with me and we'll be done.
Then I'll turn over to the audience. So the other pillar of the international liberal order is free trade, globalization. And I think it's fair to say that the electorate voted against free trade because everyone voted for, well, both candidates opposed TPP. And Hillary won by the skin of her teeth against somebody who was even more opposed to free trade than her. And so you had a takeover of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party by candidates who mobilized the base of the party against free trade, and a tiny, tiny fraction of pointy-headed intellectuals like you in the middle who still were preaching the virtues of free trade but had no constituency. So, help me salvage that part of the liberal order in today's age.
You had to leave. By the way, when you introduced me, you did not mention that I'm a war vet. I served in the army.
Yeah, that's
so
true. That's
I'm
true.
not entirely disappointing out of intellectual.
Fair enough. Yes.
Look, free trade is a good thing. I do think free trade is a good thing broadly. I think it's some libertarian economists will paint free trade almost as a moral issue, like you absolutely must allow maximum economic freedom for human beings on Earth. And I just think free trade is a good thing, but I'm not, I guess, a free trade absolutist. It's okay to kind of tap the brakes on globalization now and then for social policy. That's acceptable. Let's recognize the cost. What we're going to see in the next few years as we go down a more nationalist, almost mercantilist route, we will see the price of goods go up. Do you know what Mexico is our third largest trading partner, and if we slap a 45% tax on them, it's going to be a lot of agricultural products, cars actually, and other things we import from Mexico will all get more expensive. So that means your real incomes will go down. Your purchasing power is going to go down as things get more expensive. So we will all be poorer. We're going to get poorer. That's the price tag of our nationalist economic policy. We will be poorer. We won't be able to buy as much stuff. That's a true statement. Because we're a trendsetter in the world, a lot of other countries will follow suit. We've already seen fraying in the edges in the European Union, and I wouldn't be surprised to see other countries go down this route. And as you have rival protectionisms taking root across the world, this effect could kind of spiral. And it won't just be goods from Mexico that get more expensive. It'll be across the world. What we've all grown up with and taken for granted, where we can buy stuff that was made half a world away and it's relatively cheap. How many of you have a smartphone? Hey, where was this made? This was not made in America. Do you like your smartphone? Do you like being able to upgrade it every 2 years for cheap? Okay,
No,
that's
I wish I didn't have to upgrade it.
well,
but
yeah.
that's-
So, this is the fruit of globalization. This is a miracle device right here. And if you want this made in America, it's going to cost 2 or 3 times more. And that means your purchasing power will shrink by half or 2/3. So again, it's fine to tap the brakes on free trade now and then if necessary, but let's recognize the cost.
So that argument was tried, and the electorate voted against it in the primaries and in the general.
Can't I say the American people are wrong?
Yeah. Well, I thought democracy was part of the liberal order, right?
Well, that's why I believe in republicanism.
Who are the enemies of the liberal order that the president should be? It sounds like you're saying he's the enemy of the liberal order. But, okay, who are the external enemies to the liberal order that should be concerning?
So I will think of America's rivals and enemies in kind of three baskets. Basket number one are the nuclear autocracies. Okay, the rival kind of great powers that don't share our values and don't like us very much. Obviously, this is Russia and China, but it also includes that kind of second tier of Iran, North Korea. Pakistan has kind of been on the brink, right? So I'm not quite sure where they're going to go. And I did say nuclear autocracies, and I did include Iran, because I think Iran is effectively a nuclear power. I think the Iran nuclear deal was the codification, the face-saving codification of their breakout capability. And we're going to wait a while, several years, maybe a decade, and then they're going to be a nuclear power. And I think the security dynamic in the Middle East has already adjusted to that. Everybody treats Iran as if they have a nuclear deterrent. If that wasn't true, we would have bombed them 10 years ago. But we just kind of, we recognize that we don't have the ability to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And that's what the Iran nuclear deal was in 2015. That's part of what it was. Okay, so basket number one, nuclear autocracies. Great power rivalry. Right? So, as I was saying to some students just before this, there are intellectual trends in universities. Since the end of the Cold War, the intellectual trend has been non-state actors, failed states, the unconventional threats, the new and emerging things, which if you've taken any classes, you've taken classes in that stuff. But recognize that just because that's what's fashionable doesn't mean that's what's most important in the world. And a lot of the really old-fashioned stuff, state-centric, great power rivalry, the possibility of nuclear war, it's actually still real and true and out there. We just kind of got bored with it, and so we don't offer that many classes in it anymore. Well, then Russia invaded Ukraine. So you all better start studying nuclear war again. So basket number one is old-fashioned stuff that we just don't teach a lot anymore. Basket number two is the new fashionable things. It's the whole menagerie of armed non-state groups. Terrorists, but also slavers and pirates and organized criminals and drug traffickers and the failed states that give them operating space. Right after 9/11, we heard so many times, the failed states breed terrorism. That's not quite true. It's true in Afghanistan, but not quite true anywhere else. What is true is that failed states breed the armed non-state groups, like organized criminal gangs and drug traffickers and slavers and so forth. So if you want to defeat basket number two, you have to whack them with drones, but you also have to do nation building. You also have to help fix failed states, which no one wants to do. Obama didn't want to do it. Donald Trump doesn't want to do it. Rand Paul didn't want to do it. Ted Cruz doesn't want to do it. Nobody wants to do it. But if you ever want to actually defeat these groups, you have to do some nation building. Basket number three is where these meet. Where do the state-centric threats meet with the non-state groups? Jihadist terrorism. That's basket number three, is the jihadist movement. That's the label I'll use because I think it's the most accurate. The technical, theological term would be the Takfiri, Salafi jihadists, but that's too complicated, so I'll say the jihadists. There are some states, some parts of some states support this. Iran supports a Shia variant of this. Parts of Pakistan support this. Some quasi-state actors in Saudi Arabia support this. But for the most part, it's a non-state movement of jihadist insurgencies, terrorist groups, and drug traffickers. And so that's why I say they're kind of a hybrid of state and non-state. So those are the enemies. Nuclear autocracies, barbarians, and the failed states that they hide in, and the jihadists.
So as you, in your keen to nation building, I was suddenly reminded of Obama's statement, nation building at home. It's time to start doing nation building at home. And that reminded me of your provocative claim that Trump is a continuation of trends in Obama. So defend that argument a little bit, because on the surface, they couldn't look more different, right? Very cautious, deliberative, cautious maybe to a fault, analytical to a fault. The other, much more shoot from the hip, gut kind of player, and very different. It strikes me. So why are you saying that there's continuities there that aren't evident at superficial level?
Well, I see the continuities all over the place. Nation building at home. Donald Trump has talked about $1 trillion stimulus package. President Obama had the aspiration to reinvest in infrastructure, health, education, energy at home. I don't think Donald Trump disagrees with any of that. He disagrees with kind of how Obama went about doing healthcare, right? But I don't think Donald Trump disagrees with reinvesting at home at all. And I think we'll probably see a clash between Trump and the Republican Congress soon on that score. I think Trump would love to have a huge public works project that he can kind of put his name all over. I've talked about the continuity already between the kind of Obama's temperamental retrenchment and Trump's much more explicit advocacy for a different style of foreign policy. And there was one other aspect of continuity that I can't quite remember what I was going to say. So yeah, I think there's actually quite a lot of continuity. There's different
Skepticism on trade.
Skepticism on trade, absolutely.
Obama came in saying he was going to renegotiate NAFTA.
Yeah. President Obama's counterterrorism policy ended up being lots of drones, maybe some special forces raids, and not much else. Okay, President Bush, big expensive counterinsurgency and democratization campaigns. Obama said, too expensive, too hard, not going to do that. Drones, special forces, not much else. And I could see President Trump just going right down that line, continuing that trend, where he's promised to eradicate radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth. Right? That's his promise. So what's he going to do? He's going to drop a ton of bombs, he's going to declare victory, and he's going to go home. He's not going to do any nation building. He's not going to get a massive ground troop intervention in Syria. No way he's going to do that. He's going to drop a ton of bombs, and he's going to declare victory, and he's going to go home. And that's what Obama did in Libya. That's what Obama did against Al-Qaeda. He declared victory against Al-Qaeda like 5 times. And he with as light a footprint as possible.
So the reason I'm pressing this aspect of it is we had Colin Gall, who you know, last week, and his argument, I think if I summarize it, is American foreign policy had 8 years of mistakes from 01 to 09. 8 years of flawless execution. Now we're about to end the whole thing.
That's right.
We go off the cliff now.
Yeah.
But he would reject vehemently the idea that there was any continuity. And he would point out, say, the Iran deal, which Trump has rejected,
Right.
and Obama made a big deal about Cuba outreach, what has been criticized. So, if Colin were sitting here, how would you answer those kinds of counter arguments?
Yeah. So I love Colin is a gentleman. He's a scholar. He's we need more Collins on the other side of the aisle. Every time I hear him talk, my head explodes because I disagree with everything he says, except the part about going off the cliff. Now I agree with that. So Obama's foreign policy legacy. It starts when he started off on half the right foot in Afghanistan. He had elements of the right approach because I was there. He sent more troops, which was absolutely necessary. Nobody disagreed with that at the time. It was a wide bipartisan consensus, more troops. But he undermined it with the withdrawal deadline, which was not actually recommended by the Strategy Review Commission. The Strategy Review said counterinsurgency, more troops, selective reconstruction, and then either Obama or one of his political advisors added in the withdrawal deadline at the end. And I think it's fairly obvious that was. It is so obvious that was a mistake that Obama himself changed his mind just a year and a half ago and did not withdraw from Afghanistan. So we had 8 years of the president talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan, doing all the damage public diplomacy that will do, and then not actually withdrawing. So the whole exercise was profoundly futile. It's very frustrating to watch. So that's, first step in his legacy was kind of messing up Afghanistan, which he called the good war. He said we were going to win, and he messed that up. We didn't win. Yeah. Then he withdrew from Iraq, as he campaigned to do. He promised he would do that, but early on there were some promising signs that he was open to leaving a stay-behind force in Iraq to continue to train the Iraqi security forces. And there were negotiations between the United States and Iraq to do that, and I was hopeful that this could actually leave Iraq on a maybe stable path. And that did not happen. leave it to others to write the history of why and how that didn't happen, but it didn't happen. And the United States pulled out of Iraq entirely, and we've seen the history that's happened in the last 5 years. It's been an almost unmitigated disaster. What's really interesting is you go back to 2011 and earlier, and you listen to the people who are saying, we should not leave. And here's what they said. Megan O'Sullivan said this, President Bush said this, he said, we should not leave because the jihadists will reconstitute, they will metastasize, the Iraqi state is in danger of collapse, there will be atrocities and near genocidal levels of violence if we leave. And they were exactly right. That is exactly what happened. So don't let anyone ever tell you that we can't forecast and that we didn't know what was going to happen. We knew what would happen when we withdrew from Iraq, and it happened. So there's a mess now in the Middle East today, and it's because we withdrew from Iraq too early. Look, have the opinions you want to have about getting into Iraq. President Obama always said we need to get out as responsibly as we got into it irresponsibly. He failed to do that. He failed to do that. So that's another element of his foreign policy legacy. We could have prevented the absolute chaos in Iraq and Syria that exists today if we hadn't withdrawn from Iraq the way we did, when we did, how we did. Libya. Thinking that he had learned the lessons of history, he thought, okay, there's an atrocity about to happen. We're about to see mass crimes against humanity. We have to do something to stop. But we know we shouldn't do nation building, so we'll just overthrow a government and leave. Libya today is a terrorist safe haven. Libya today is not a model for intervention. Even the Obama administration has acknowledged this. This is just not their finest hour. Syria. Syria is a very difficult, it's an easy criticism to make because Syria is a humanitarian catastrophe and the Red Line fiasco makes it a very easy criticism to launch against the Obama administration. The red line where Obama said, this is the red line that he didn't enforce it, was an own goal. That was a blow to American credibility, and that merits the criticism it's received. I don't know what else we could have done, unless back in 2011 we had invaded Syria. What else could we have done? So I'm a little bit less inclined to blame Syria on Obama than maybe some others. It's just hard to know what we could have done differently.
And on the Syria red line, which you say is an easy one, Colin, I can hear him saying, well, we got the deal, the Russia brokered deal, which removed the lion's share of the chemical arsenal that Assad was willing to declare. 99% of that is gone. That's a big win.
Of what Assad was willing to declare, which who knows what portion that is of a larger chemical weapons stockpile. And that's a pretty small thing to aim at. Okay, so you successfully...
Small thing to aim at. We invaded Iraq to get that kind of success.
But has the removal of Assad's chemical weapons addressed or solved or mitigated at all any of the really major underlying problems in the Middle East? Has it stopped the genocide? Has it stopped the civil war? Has it stopped the rise of ISIS? It's not stopped none of that stuff. So, okay, congratulations, you got Assad to give up some chemical weapons. If that's your silver lining, there's still a pretty dark cloud there. Beyond the Middle East, the Obama legacy has this. I kind of joked that he declared war, he declared victory against Al-Qaeda 5 times. Well, he did, several times. 2011, he said the tide of war is receding. It is not receding. And he failed as a public communicator on this very important issue. He did not clearly articulate the nature of the war. Therefore, we didn't win the war. We never, under Obama or Bush, we never came to grips with the conditions of victory against the jihadist groups. And that is why 16 years on, we're still grappling with this problem. Russia invades Ukraine, the United States does very little about it. The Iran nuclear deal, the Obama administration thinks is a success. I think it's the codification of our defeat in Iraq. We lose in Iraq, we withdraw. We have no leverage. Iran is the natural regional hegemon, and so they get the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal is the codification of their regional hegemony and our defeat in Iraq. That's what it actually is. And within the decade, you'll see that, if things continue on as they are, you'll see Iran's regional hegemony gradually more solidified and more explicitly recognized. That's what the Iran nuclear deal actually is. The Obama team thinks it's a victory, but it's the best deal we could have got since we lost the war in Iraq.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my last question, and then as you're answering it, I'll collect questions, names, faces of people to ask. So you said that the election was not about foreign policy. And so that suggests that there's not a big mandate for a big change in foreign policy. And secondly, let me put it to you that Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, Reince Priebus, Nikki Haley, I'm mentioning now members of his national security cabinet. They are sort of cut from the same molded cloth, more or less, as you're describing here. They might have a tweak here or there. Tillerson won't talk about values quite the same way you would, but and Mattis might be more skeptical about nation building on the margins, more so do Afghan good enough rather than stuff. So there'd be tweaks to it, but by golly, they'd be within the boundary, penumbra of your argument. So isn't it possible that once the Trump team is staffed up, and as their policies hit reality and then don't work, that we'll have an adjustment back to something in the middle? Isn't there a deeper American pattern of wild rhetoric about change, then reality intrudes, and you get something down the middle? Is there any reason to hope for that in the Trump administration? Is what my last question to you, and then we have.
Maybe, and I hope you're right. You listed off several members of the Trump team, like Mattis and Tillerson, and Tillerson in particular is not the best, not the people I pick, but they're not horrible. They will do the job. However, there's one member of the Trump team you didn't mention, and that's Donald Trump. As the president, he's the one who makes the call, and he also gets to choose who he listens to. And I think we've only had a week or 10 days to see any patterns emerge, but it does seem within these 10 days that he's more inclined to listen to his closest circle, which is people like Steve Bannon and my evil twin brother, Steve Miller, and Mike Flynn, the National Security Advisor, who I think is a wild card. I'm not quite sure kind of where he really falls in the world. He's got a long career in national security, but he can be a little erratic. So you painted a picture where, like, the best case scenario is they make enough mistakes that, as a last resort, he begins to listen to people like Mattis and Tillerson. And if indeed that's the best we can hope for, that's still pretty bad. And you can do a lot of damage in the meantime. What I worry about is that liberal order has been eroding. It's been eroding under Obama. It's actually been eroding since before then, for a number of reasons, not just related to US policy, but it's been eroding from a number of factors. And now it will continue to erode, certainly in the first part of the Trump administration, if not the whole part. And by the time we get to an inflection point where Trump or Pence or the next president realizes, boy, we're in a mess, we need to kind of go back, how hard is it going to be to rebuild? And actually, will it be possible to rebuild? Will our allies be there to listen? Will we have the window of opportunity to reinvest in the institutions of liberal order anymore? I don't know. Trump can do a lot of damage in the meantime. So.
Thank you for being here today. I want to bring us back to Pakistan. There's always tension in the region between Pakistan and India. It seems like there's been a slight uptick recently. If that continues and Trump does not act... my question's regarding Pakistan, and that there's been tensions there always, but it seems like more so recently. And that if Trump does not act as a neutral arbiter, do you have any inclination as to which side you think he would fall on, and if so, what the implications of that will be for the region?
Yeah. Well, big picture here, the United States has been trying to cultivate a good relationship with India for the last 20 years. Bill Clinton tried with the region in 98, 99. He tried to kind of warm up to India. As you probably know, relationship back in the Cold War was very bad. India was neutral but kind of pro-Soviet. But since the 90s, we've recognized that we and India have a lot in common. We're both worried about China's rise. We're both worried about Islamic jihadist terrorism. And so there's been an effort to cultivate that. President Bush continued that with the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Initiative. Obama gave public support to India's bid for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And I think all that's good. I actually am very bullish on India. I think that it would be great for us to do anything we can to be friends with India, even changing our policy towards Pakistan. If you look at the balance, I think we have more to gain from a potential partnership with India than we've ever got from Pakistan. Because Pakistan is, they signed treaties of alliance with us. What do we get for it? They did help us against Al-Qaeda. They did. But that was also in their interest. Al-Qaeda was trying to assassinate President Bashar. So yes, they cooperated against Al-Qaeda, good for them. But did they cooperate against the Afghan Taliban? No, they did not. No, they actually probably helped the Taliban. So I don't know that we get a lot. There's some intelligence sharing and so forth with Pakistan. We could probably get that from India if we cultivated that relationship for the next 2 decades. So I'd love to see us continue the tilt. It's very difficult to do that. DoD has a bad case of clientitis with Pakistan. The U.S. and the Pakistani military have trained so long together that try to tell DoD, we're not going to invest in Pakistan anymore. And you get a bureaucratic fight on your hands that is just miserable. And DoD is not the only one. So, yeah, there's that's my answer. It's probably not going to happen.
Thank you so much again for coming. You actually partially answered my question in response to Professor Feger's last question. But I was going to ask about the soft power stakes of Trump's presidency, if he doesn't pivot towards a more middle-of-the-road policy, if you think 4 to 8 years down the line, if another president more invested in the liberal order that you mentioned, if the states would still be a contender to be like the leader in that process.
Yeah, there's some hard realities about American power that will always, for the foreseeable future, put us in the driver's seat so long as we are content to put our hands on the wheel. Despite what you may hear about the decline of American power, we're still it. We still really are the indispensable nation. So let's assume 4 years go by and we get a president more inclined towards the liberal order. Yeah, I think that those hard realities will compel the world to sort of pay attention if we try to reassert that leadership role. The United States still has the world's largest, most expensive military, and still has about 22-25% of world GDP. These are realities that don't change very fast, and Trump can only do so much. So.
Yeah, I want to. Well, I'll let you go on that.
Although it may be interesting to see what China does in the next 4 years to pick up some of that mantle and how successful they'll be. I can't see them being that successful, but they could, like India during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, they could maybe start to gravitate other developing world countries. I don't know.
I mean, well, where I was going to go is that China presented it. Xi Jinping's speech at Davos was an alternative version of the liberal order. It was the economic part without the political part, and that was the Chinese, the Beijing model that was so popular in 2009, 2010, and maybe there's a revival of interest in that. Anyway, that's where I was going to go. There are alternative isms out there that could compete with the liberal order.
Yeah, and there's a job for American public diplomacy there to go out there and forcefully articulate that you can't really pick and choose your freedoms like a cafeteria menu. And if you try that, the Beijing model is ultimately self-defeating. This is the case I make. The Beijing model is ultimately self-defeating. It leads. Look at the Chinese economy. Is it really robust and healthy, or is that just kind of state-cooked statistics? It's a lot of heavy state investment in infrastructure. It's, by the way, horribly corrupt. If I had money, I would not put it in the Chinese stock market. I wouldn't. Get your money out of the Chinese stock market. I think it's very prudent to recognize there's some structural flaws in how they do their stuff. This is the case I'd make. And I'd say, look, if you want robust growth, you have to have transparency. And if you have transparency, you kind of have to have free speech and free press. And by the way, once you open that door, you can't close it to anything else. It's kind of an all or nothing deal. And that's the case I'd like to see rather than what I say.
Yeah, this question leads directly to my question of kind of the alternativisms. And it seemed in hearing your talk, it seems as though everything you've been talking about is predicated upon the U.S. being in a position to shape and defend this liberal order. And I heard very little about how do we adapt that model to account for a rising China and India, just by the very nature of the trajectories that they're on, will have maybe different conceptions of what that order should be. So how should the United States kind of change or adapt the institutions and its conception of the liberal order to meet that new reality?
Well, the institutions of liberal order have been evolving constantly, forever, particularly since the end of the Cold War. And liberal order has many pillars to stand on. So Europe is, a major pillar of liberal order. 25 years ago, half of Europe was not included in it. And Eastern Europe democratized kind of overnight, and it was a miracle. It was an amazing miracle. And over the following decade, Eastern Europe was incorporated into the EU and into NATO. That's one way of adapting those institutions, was extending the umbrella. And you could tell somewhat a similar story of East Asia. There have been other small things that happened that the newspapers never report, like the World Bank changed the weight of the votes. Everybody gets a vote in the World Bank stuff, and China's vote weight got increased like 5 times in the last 20 years. That's probably a good thing to account for the underlying power realities. So I would be happy for those sorts of things to continue. What I don't want to see is China create its own bank, which they did. I think that probably is unhelpful. I would love it for them to kind of stay in the established institutions and play a bigger role. That's fine. Play a bigger role commensurate with their power, so long as they're a responsible stakeholder. And we can continue to adjust that way. I think it's unhelpful for them to create parallel alternate institutions. Other way to adapt, go back to India again. Look, India is and should be a major pillar of liberal order, the world's largest democracy, the other rising economic superpower of the 21st century. They are shooting themselves in the foot and a little unhelpfully too standoffish towards Europe and the United States. They got some history with Britain, right? So it would be great if we could help allay those anxieties and treat them as a respected equal partner in the liberal order, and that would be fantastic if we could do that. And if that means reforming the UN, great.
So thanks for being here. My name is Sean Callan. I'm a senior ROTC cadet, Army ROTC, and obviously a member of the AGS Council. I share in your perspective that the implementation and maintenance of the liberal order in places like Iraq and Afghanistan are a key way to help bring stability to the region. But as we know, key inhibitors in establishing that liberal order are corruption and lack of public faith in governance. And citing David Kilcullen in his book, Counterinsurgency.
Are you talking about Iraq or the United States?
Iraq and Afghanistan, namely. And those two elements, corruption and lack of public faith in governance, are also key draws to insurgencies.
Yeah.
So do you think the American foreign policy strategy and American intervention have been adequately combating that corruption and lack of public faith in governance, or do you think we need to readdress those issues and try to fix those before we can think we can install a liberal order?
So, back to Iraq and Afghanistan. Here's what we actually did in Afghanistan the first 5 years or so. We helped with their political process. We hosted a couple of elections. We kind of stood by while they wrote their constitution and ratified it. They did it most of it themselves. We kind of provided the arena for it. And we did dump a decent amount of money on roads and electricity in those early years. We did virtually nothing to rebuild their army or their police, and nothing to rebuild their bureaucracy or their rule of law. It's mostly the Italians' fault. So what happens when you dump several $1 billion on a failed state with no rule of law? That equals corruption. Duh. So how should we have done it? Well, take some of that $1 billion or several $1 billion and build bureaucrats. It's a very unglamorous thing to do. And by the way, what's it called? It's called nation building, which is evil. We all know that, right? It's evil. We can't do that. But what did we do in Germany? Right? We built bureaucrats in West Germany after World War II.
Well, Weber had a start ahead of us, right?
Yeah.
So the argument would be inhospitable terrain. They had Germany, of course. They knew bureaucracy. They invented it.
Yeah. Well, no,
They invented the modern version.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that the Afghans had no bureaucracy before 2001? Well, they did. They had bureaucracy that was being built since the 1880s, from the Iron Year. Unfortunately, it was mostly a Soviet bureaucracy. That was the big problem. It wasn't the absence of bureaucracy, it was the fact that it was mostly on the Soviet hold. The Soviets rebuilt their bureaucracies in the 1980s. And so you have Soviet bureaucracy with Taliban governance, and that's what you had in 2001. So it was pretty bad, but it wasn't a blank slate. What we could and should have done is maybe wipe the slate clean, but a much greater effort to embed civilians from the American bureaucracy into the Afghan bureaucracy by the thousands. By the thousands, we should have done that in order to train the Afghans. Of course, you need language capability to do that. I don't know where you get that. But you need that level of effort if you wanted to see a real meaningful increase in capacity to combat corruption and to actually deliver public services. That's how you get Afghans to trust their government. And by the way, it's actually cheaper to send thousands of civilians than to send 100,000 American troops. It really is. So send in a couple thousand civilians and you'll get a lot more bang for that buck, I think.
Hi, you kind of skimmed on it with the UN and India, but I just want to know, how do you think we can navigate our multilateral political commitments in an American first liberal world order? So, I mean, it's not just bilateral, like we have UN to deal with too.
So are you saying, how do you think Donald Trump is going to do this?
No, I mean, in your vision with how we should do this.
My vision?
Yeah.
Well, so again, I point to my subtitle about it being a conservative internationalist grand strategy. I think international institutions are good, but they're probably not the most important tool for diplomacy or for kind of getting things done in the world. Liberal internationalists put a huge amount of faith in the UN, World Bank, IMF, treaties, that kind of thing. And I'm not against them, but I think they are a second-tier tool set. I think the premier tool set is more tools of hard power. And by the way, I include cash as hard power. So our buying power, our economic model, our market access is a massive tool that is very effective for conducting diplomacy, as is our military. Our military is a tool of diplomacy. And I know that, in case that's cognitive dissonance for anybody, the military gives weight to what we say. If Iceland, which has no military, said to China, we don't like what you're doing in the South China Sea, building these artificial islands, China will do exactly nothing about it. If the United States says with words on paper, we don't like what you're doing in the South China Sea, China will not do a whole lot about that. If we sail an aircraft carrier battle group through the Taiwan Strait, China will pay attention to that. Now, I know that might make you feel uncomfortable, like I'm saber-rattling, I'm a warmonger, I'm a hawk, but that's a reality. That's how the world actually works. And if you're interested in diplomacy, you have to be comfortable with those tools of national power. So, in answer to your question, I'm not saying get out of the UN. I think Trump might say that, or he might act like that. He might just ignore the UN. I don't think we should ignore the UN. The UN's very good on refugee camps. It's very good as a clearinghouse for diplomacy, but we need to supplement that with other tools of national power.
I mean, we worked with the UN in Afghanistan to do nation building military, so.
Yeah. Is that a question? Because I can talk another 30 minutes on that.
Yeah.
There's coordination problems in Afghanistan. More effort on our part puts us in the lead more, and then we can kind of tell the UN what to do, but we didn't do that, and so it was a coordination problem endlessly.
So I just wanted to build off of Tyler's question about Pakistan. In your earlier discussions about Pakistan, I've heard sort of echoes of Anatole Lieben's argument about Pakistan being a hard, but
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right, a hard but a resilient country in the
Yes.
sense that there are institutions or rather structures within that
Civil
country,
society.
civil society in that country that allow it to be resilient and has better impulses. So I'm curious if you could kind of come back to Pakistan and apply sort of the liberal world order versus realist lens in this idea that, first of all, maybe you could speak to what extent does Pakistan in the modern era, for geopolitical, for non-proliferation reasons, continue to represent, or does it represent, core national security interests for the United States? And then moving forward, what does that future relationship look like, whether it be to appeal to civil society and more liberal interests? And then I guess also in context of people talked about maybe the growing role of China, in particular China in Pakistan, and sort of their investment.
So fix Pakistan.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I used to say that Pakistan was the hardest problem in foreign policy. Then Syria blew it. I think it's still probably the second hardest. That doesn't mean it's the most important. I think there are more important things. Actually, the war in Ukraine is way up there. But it is extraordinarily difficult to understand how to have a coherent policy towards what I think is an incoherent government. Now, Pakistan as a country is way more than its government, and resilient at the local level. You know, there's a much stronger, I think, Punjabi identity than a Pakistani identity, much stronger Sindhi identity than a Pakistani identity. The Pakistani government, I think of it this way. You have rival centers of power between illiberal civilian oligarchs, Nawaz Sharif and his mafia almost, and the illiberal military autocrats, who, by the way, sponsor a lot of jihadist groups. Not all of them, but some of them. And so both of them do good things and bad things. The civilians, at least, aren't sponsoring the jihadists. Great. The civilians, they want economic growth. And they're more focused on that, which kind of aligns with some of what we'd like to see in South Asia. We'd love to see economic growth and all that. And the military cooperates against Al-Qaeda. We love that. Not against the other groups, but against Al-Qaeda. We love that. And so we have this weird relationship where we have different policies towards different parts of the government in one country. The Obama administration's policy was try to essentially buy the loyalty of the civilians with the Kerry Lugar bill, dump $10 billion in aid on them, and hope that the military is sidelined while still cooperating with us. And that we don't know if that would have worked because 2011 happened, Abbottabad, and the border strike, and everything went south. So it matters less now that we only have 10,000 troops in Afghanistan. The relationship with Pakistan was hugely important because they held a Damocles sword over our head with all our troops in Afghanistan and most of our supplies going through Pakistan. That doesn't matter so much anymore. And I think that a new administration has the opportunity to kind of reapproach Pakistan and I don't know what. With the Afghan Taliban almost off the table, you can kind of reapproach Pakistan and say, look, can we start over again? Can we maybe go back to the way things were 15 years ago, before 9/11? Or maybe actually 30 years ago, before the Taliban. It feels to me that the moment is ripe for that kind of, reset button. But I don't know. Super long way of saying that.
Thanks.
So with an administration that's less prone to nation building than ours, what can, say, Ashraf Ghani do in Afghanistan right now to start rebuilding, to start working towards the world order, besides trying to recruit citizens into the civil service, which is always important?
Well, I think that he needs to resolve this political crisis once and for all. His government's been paralyzed for 2 years because of the non-functional National Unity Government. Well, on paper, he's supposed to have held a Voyager, I think, to consider changes to the Constitution. That would not be a bad thing to do. Very demanding logistically, financially, and security-wise to do that. But look, for 15 years, we've looked at their system of government and said, this might be a little too centralized. And once again, let me remind you, we didn't write their Constitution. There's a myth out there, the Americans wrote their Constitution. False, we didn't. They adopted their Constitution, they changed king to president. So that means the president formally has all the powers of a king. It's kind of a bad idea in a country pretending to be a democracy. So analysts on the outside have long said some constitutional revision might be a good idea. I think Ghani should maybe start there and actually do some good faith efforts at constitutional revision, solve that political crisis, bring the Tajiks in, then he can be more confident commanding the loyalty of the Afghan army. I'm deeply concerned about his ability to command the Afghan army. He's not a warlord. He's not a war commander. He's not a wartime president. He's a technocrat from the World Bank. But he needs to be able to command the army if he's going to win the counterinsurgency against the Taliban. To do that, he has to have true national unity in his government. If he doesn't do that, right now the most professional institution in the country is the Afghan army. And the Afghan army is trying to defend a country that is horribly corrupt against an enemy that they're sworn enemies with. Look, what I'm saying is in 5 to 10 years, the Afghan army might just give up on Ghani or whoever's president and try to run the country themselves. They might pull a Pakistan. And so Ghani is walking a tightrope and the clock's running out. So resolve the political crisis, do some constitutional revision, take control of the Afghan army, and then you can really make inroads against the Taliban.
So we have time for just two last questions. One here.
How integral do you see Western Europe to this liberal world order? And also, do you see the current sort of wobble to the right there as a serious threat, or is it something that doesn't bother you too much?
Do I see the what?
The wobble to the right.
Hugely important, and yes, the wobble is a little concerning. And I say it's important because if you just look at the world, survey the world, and look at the numbers, where is the wealth, where is the power, and where is the danger? And the answer is still Europe and East Asia. That's been true for like 4 centuries, and it's still true. It's one of those pieces of conventional wisdom that is still true. So it's like a quarter of American trade, a quarter of world GDP, 3 nuclear powers, if you count Russia, and 1 and maybe more potential nuclear powers in Europe. This is where the concentration of the world's wealth and power is, and with Russia, it's where a really big threat is as well. So Europe is still hugely important. Brexit is survivable. It's not a great sign. It's not a great trend line, but it's survivable. I'm not that worried about it. I'm more worried about, say, the erosion of democracy in Hungary, and maybe Greece, and maybe Poland, because if that continues, sooner or later a nationalist, autocratic ruler of, say, Poland might be more inclined to bandwagon with Russia than balance against it. And if we start losing Eastern Europe as an ally, that's bad. It's very bad. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay, so I'm James, I'm a sophomore, thanks for being here. So you must have heard Kissinger's book, World Order, and it talks about the Westphalia system which have maintained peace in Europe for like a long time. So I want to ask you, what's the similarity and difference between your liberal order and Kissinger's World Order?
Well,
I can give you our answer. That's
30 seconds or less. Why I'm smarter than Henry Kissinger. I think liberal order is layered over on top of its a version of Westphalian order. I don't think they're contradictory. Kissinger, of course, is more of a realist, and he would probably discount the importance or give relatively less importance to ideology, culture, and values than I do. I do give them pretty significant weight, and I think that shapes the way we perceive threats, and it shapes the way we define what counts as security. So that's where I guess differ with Kissinger a little bit, but I'm not against Westphalian order, sovereignty, and all that. That's just true, and will be probably forever.
Well, it remains for me to say that I am glad you came, and I am glad that you wrote this book. I wish you were Steve Miller writing his memos, and I hope that you are too pessimistic about our hurt, and we'll have to bring you back in 4 years and you can tell us whether you were too pessimistic. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking you.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, okay, great. What are you doing?
Oh yeah, I also heard that. Sorry. You're really impatient with the galaxy. Oh yeah.
I was like,
You want to help me carry these tables?
for sure.